Hello, my name is Napa, call sign Speedy, and welcome to Lesson 1 of the Basic Flight Course series. In this video, we're going to go over the ground school portion of Lesson 1. Let's get some legal stuff out of the way first. This isn't real flight training, nor can it be used in lieu of real flight training. Some techniques and procedures taught here are based on real-world techniques, but are adapted for simulator use. All techniques, procedures, and concepts are from public open-source documents. All opinions and comments stated in this video are those of the producer and do not reflect any official policy of the DoD or its components concerning military flight training. Alright, let's get this show on the road. Our learning objectives for today will be getting a basic understanding of fundamental aviation physics and aircraft control services. In other videos, we will be going over maneuvers used to get familiar with aircraft handling. Let's get started. First off, let's start with basic physics, the four forces that affect flight, which are lift, weight or gravity, thrust, and drag. Aviation is all about balancing these forces. Let's talk about thrust first. Most aircraft in DCS use jet engines, whose operation can be summed up simply with suck, squeeze, blow, and blow. Suck basically means the jet engine sucks the air into the engines through the fan blades, right here in this front portion. It then squeezes the air in the compressor section, which is this section right here. It then ignites the compressed air in the combustion chamber, which is the first blow, and then the second blow is where it shoves it right out the back, thus creating thrust, right? So that action of pushing something out the back is, the opposite reaction of that's moving that element forward, moving the engine forward, which is attached to the aircraft, which generates thrust, right? So as you can see in this image above here, it acts along the axes that the engine is mounted in. So if the engine is pointed straight back, the reaction will be pushing straight forward. And there's a couple of different types of jet engines, and we're going to go over those right now. So first one we're going to see here is turbojet. Okay, this is more common. This is the original type of jet engine that you see. This is very common with your older airframes, your F5s, your MiG-15s, F-86s, things like that, where all of the air coming in gets ejected out the back. Okay, every piece of it. That is 100% your thrust. This is exactly what we were describing. Okay. The next one that gets seen, or that we see here, is the turbofan engine, where part of the thrust is coming out the back, but part of it is also generated by the front blades here, because air goes around the engine, so it gets shoved through and around the engine, comes out the back. So part of it is the exhaust from the engine itself, and part of it is this bypassed air coming around as well. This is more common on some of your more modern jets, your F-16, your F-15, your F-18, your large airliners. Those have these types of engines as well. This is more modern type of engine design. It's used for fuel efficiency, noise control, things like that. Okay. The other one that is common seen is turboprops. Okay. Turboprops is a jet engine with basically a propeller attached to the front of it. Okay. Yes, there's a transmission that controls RPM and things of that nature, but in essence, that prop right there basically generates all of the thrust. None of the thrust coming out the exhaust of that engine is generating thrust. The only thing that's generating thrust is the torque generated by the engine pushing that propeller. That propeller is what's generating everything. Okay, this is what you have common with your primary trainers. Your T6s, A29s, PC9s, things like that typically have your turboprops here. Okay. A lot of your propeller-driven cargo aircraft, C-130s and the like that, are also turboprop like this as well. I know that in DCS we also have warbirds available that have radial or reciprocating engines, but those will be covered in a different video series for transition to warbirds. The second force we're going to talk about is weight or gravity. Weight is how heavy the aircraft is and is usually described as gross weight, which is the total weight of the aircraft. Weight simply describes the amount of pull gravity has on the object. Gravity is the force that pulls an object to the center of the Earth. In the context of aircraft, it's the force that lift has to counteract or fight to allow the aircraft to fly. The effect of gravity is completely independent of the attitude of the aircraft. This basically means that no matter how much you bank or pitch the aircraft, gravity will always be pulling you towards the center of the Earth. This is an important concept. You'll see it again in a little while. So as you see in the diagrams down here, the aircraft bank angle here has zero bearing on gravity, that white arrow here pointing straight down, right? The more you bank, it's still pulling in the exact same direction. The next concept that we'll be going over is drag. Drag is defined as forces that oppose the relative motion of an object through the air. It essentially is the force that counteracts thrust. And there are two different types of drags. You have parasite drag and induced drag. In short, parasite drag is anything that disrupts the normal flow of air around the aircraft. Weapons, rivets, antennas, air brakes, spoilers, things like that. Sticking your hand out the window while driving down the road and turning your hand palm forward, that force shoving your hand towards the back of the car is parasite drag. Induced drag is the drag that is the result of the generation of lift. We'll go over this in a little more detail in a minute, bear with me. But in essence, the slower your airspeed, the higher the induced drag and lower the effect of parasite drag. So induced drag's up here, parasite drag's down here, all right? The higher your airspeed, the lower the effect of induced drag, the higher the effect of parasite drag. Okay? Because the faster you're going, the more that air is trying to come across. Okay? Your parasite drag, anything that's interrupting that flow, has a greater effect. When you're going slower, there isn't that much force of the air coming across, so parasite drag has no effect. And last, but certainly not least, let's talk about lift. Lift is defined as the force that directly opposes the weight of an airplane and holds the airplane in the air. Lift can be generated by any part of the airplane if designed to do so. The body, the wings, it doesn't really matter. Lift is generated by the movement of air over the airfoil. Air over the top of the foil is moving faster, and therefore creates a lower pressure area. And since the air below the airfoil is slower and maintaining a higher pressure than the top, which then moves the airfoil into the lower pressure zone, basically moves this airfoil up. This whole process is the generation of lift. Okay? And lift always acts perpendicular to the surface of the wings. It's always through the surface of the wings. Okay? Always. This is important. When you go into more advanced concepts, this will come back. You will see this again. Let's take a look at this video from wind tunnel testing at Cambridge University. You can see how the wind flows around the wing. Now they're going to pull smoke through the tunnel so you can see the velocity difference between the wind at the top of the wing. As you can see right here, coming across, it's going to hit the leading edge foil, come over the top, and the bottom of the wing. So as the top one increases, as you can see, the bottom one slows down considerably. Okay, that speed differential, that difference right there, is what is generating lift. It's generating that pressure differential between the bottom and the top, which allows our aircraft to operate and gives us the ability to fly. Another important factor of lift is that of lift vector, or direction that lift is generated. As we mentioned before, lift is always perpendicular to the upper surface of the wings. So, as you're flying straight and level, gravity and lift are completely opposite. Okay? Now as the pitch and angle of bank are changed, you can see that the lift vector has changed with it. No longer is it directly opposite of gravity. Now it's off at an angle. That means that some of that lift vector is not being used for counteracting gravity, or is not much of it is available to counteract gravity. Okay? As it increases, and as the pitch increases, you can see that even less of it is now operating counteracting gravity. Like for this example right here, with the aircraft pointed straight up, none of that lift vector is counteracting gravity. The only thing that's counteracting gravity at this point is thrust, because thrust is pushing in that opposite direction. So not only is it fighting gravity, now it's fighting all the other components as well, all the other drag components. Another factor that affects lift and an aircraft in flight is angle of attack. Angle of attack, or alpha as it is also called, is the angular difference between the wing chord and relative airflow. This blue line right here and this black dotted line. Black dotted line is wing chord, blue line is your relative wind, right? The reason this is important is because as alpha increases, the efficiency of the wing decreases. Okay, so if you this is where induced drag comes into play. Induced drag, which is generation of lift. This part right back here, in a low angle of attack scenario, there's a little bit of drag back here. As the angle of attack increases, you'll see it start climbing, right? So as that drag generates, as the wind, as this upper portion of the airflow can no longer stay with the wing, once it separates, it starts creating drag, okay, and it starts walking forward of the wing as the angle of attack increases. Okay, as it increases, it will increase to a point where less and less of the wind is working, less and less of the wing is working. Okay, to the point where it can't generate enough lift to keep the aircraft in the air. Okay, this is where that low speed, high induced drag portion of that chart comes into play. Okay, at this point, the aircraft is no longer flying. Let's take a quick look at this wind tunnel video from DFAN 315, which shows how angle of attack affects the airflow. As you can see, as the wing's alpha increases, the airflow begins to separate from the airfoil. Those areas on top are not only not generating lift, they are generating drag, induced drag to be accurate. This is why induced drag is at its highest at slow flight and decreases as airspeed increases. Flaps and slats aren't necessarily controls as much as devices we can set that can generate more lift when needed. The flaps are typically the inbound portion of the trailing edge of the wings. So as you can see in this portion of the T-45 right here, okay, those are flaps right there. They drop down to change the angle of attack without needing to change the pitch. So if you look right here at this portion right here in the back of the wing is the flaps. As it comes down, you'll see the wing chord change. Because remember, the wing chord is a line that's drawn from the front tip, most forward tip of the wing foil, to the most rear portion of the wing foil. That's the wing chord. Well, as that flap comes down, it changes the wing chord without changing pitch, thereby creating more lift while allowing the aircraft to go slower. Leading edge slats are these beginning portion, the leading edge portion of the wings that can slide down, also helping in generating more lift. Okay, what they do is they change the shape of the airfoil, creating a much more lift generating stuff. We can kind of get into that with airfoil design and dynamics and whatnot. It's a pretty deep subject. Okay, let's go over the primary flight controls of the aircraft. Since an aircraft is a flying object, all movement is done around the center of gravity. So all axes of movement move through the CG right here. Okay. First one we're going to talk about is the ailerons, which control the aircraft movement along the longitudinal axis right here. They are control surfaces on the trailing edge of the outer portion of the main wings. Let's take a quick look at the demo of how ailerons work. Here's a really well done video by Rajendra Prasad. Sorry if I'm butchering that. That does a really good job of illustrating it. As you move the controls to the right aileron lifts up, dumping lift, and the left aileron drops down, creating lift. This differential lift rolls the aircraft to the right. When you move the control surfaces to the left, the controls move in the opposite direction, where the left one lifts up, dumping lift, and the right one drops down, creating lift, rolling the aircraft in the other direction. The next set of controls we're going to cover will be pitch controls. Elevators are controls here on the trailing edge of the rear horizontal stabilizer, and it controls movement along the horizontal axis through the lateral axis here. Okay. It allows control of the aircraft of moving the nose relatively up or down. So the left image you see here is a traditional elevator control on the trailing edge of the horizontal stabilizer. Stabilizers don't move up and down, and the elevator does. As the aircraft design has progressed, they've been able to combine functions into a single control surface. Okay, into elevons here. Very common example is this image right here on the right hand side, where the entire stabilizer moves with the control inputs. You pull back on the stick, it goes up. You push forward on the stick, it goes down. Same thing with the elevator. You pull back on the stick, that trailing edge comes up. You push forward on the stick, the trailing edge comes down. You'll also notice that controls work like mini flaps. They manipulate lift on those wing surfaces to initiate the response needed. And the rudder is no different. The rudder is on the vertical stabilizer. It's this rear portion right here. Only it manipulates a surface that is in the vertical, thus moving the nose left and right. It controls movement along the vertical axes. So you step on the left pedal, the nose goes left. You step on the right pedal, and the nose goes right. Most high-performance aircraft have an additional device that is used to help in slowing down the aircraft. Speed brakes are basically surfaces that spread open to create more parasite drag, which in turn slows the aircraft down. Speed brakes come in different designs. We have images here on the brakes on the A29, which comes out the bottom of the airframe, and the T45, which opens out on either side of the main tail area, as well as some from the Viper, the A10 Warthog, and the Hornet. As you can see, they are all different with also differing levels of effectiveness too. Part of our jobs as pilots is to understand how effective the brakes on our airframe are and how best to use them to our advantage. All aircraft since the 1930s have at a minimum the following flight instruments. They are also referred to as the six-pack. They always have these instruments, they just might not be in the same place on the control panel. Annoyingly enough, no two panels are alike. Or even display the same unit of measure, kilometers versus knots, feet versus meters. Let's go ahead and go down the list of these common instruments. First one you're going to see here is going to be the airspeed indicator, okay, which displays, when you read it right off the gauge, it is known as indicated airspeed. Okay, there's a couple of different airspeeds that apply in DCS, or that you'll hear, or terms you're going to hear. One's calibrated airspeed, which is airspeed corrected for instrumentation errors, really doesn't apply for DCS. And ground speed. Ground speed is another term you hear, and we'll be going over that in more detail in the navigation class, but it's basically the speed at which the aircraft is covering from point A to point B over the ground. Okay, so airspeed indicator shows how fast the airflow is going over the wings. This number, this gauge right here, is basically going to tell you how close you are to stalling out your aircraft. Okay. Next one we're going to take a look at here is your attitude indicator. Your attitude indicator shows your pitch and your bank angle of bank for your aircraft. Okay, so it basically tells you, are you pointing up, pointing down, are you turning, or are you banking left, banking right? It tells you in what position the aircraft is in right now. Okay. Next one here is going to be the altimeter, which basically shows the altitude of the aircraft, and it shows it in different ways. But if set properly, it's typically showing above ground, above sea level. Okay. Now, in DCS, you're going to hear a couple of terms: QNE, QNH, QFE. Okay. QNE is basically standard temperature and pressure, standard as defined by the FAA and the European aviation body, which is basically 29.92 inches of mercury, or 1013 helipascals. Okay. QNH is the current air pressure setting. So whatever the air pressure is at that time in that location, okay, that's QNH. QFE is the setting you need to put in order for the altimeter to read 0 at the threshold or at the beginning of the runway. Okay. Some people like to call it a kind of poor man's above ground level, and it can be just within certain parameters, understanding that it's only above the beginning of the runway. Terrain around, it doesn't take into consideration any terrain around it that could be coming up or coming down or be higher or lower than that point on the runway. Okay. Next is going to be your heading indicator, okay, which shows the current heading of the aircraft. Now, the heading indicator is gyro-driven indicator. It's not magnetic. That means that in order for the heading indicator to work, the engine has to be operating, one. Okay, and two, once you do start the engine, you need to get this aligned. Okay, so you actually have to match it to a magnetic one that is in the aircraft. All aircraft usually have a wet compass or a magnetic compass in there. It's called a wet compass because that ball is usually suspended in fluid and allows it to move freely. Okay, that's why it's called a wet compass. But you have to align your heading indicator, which is gyro-driven, with the magnetic one. Okay, that's very important with these older instruments. Okay, now, vertical speed indicator. The difference between the previous four we've talked about is those are showing the current state of the aircraft. Okay. The vertical speed indicator does not. The vertical speed indicator shows the rate of movement of the aircraft. Okay. By that meaning is that it's showing how fast you are climbing or descending at that point. right? So if you look at that gauge where it says 0.5, that in this particular instrumentation we're seeing right here, which is 1,000 feet per minute, is 500 feet per minute, 1,000 feet per minute, 1,500 feet per minute, or 2,000. These numbers might be different in different aircraft and different instruments. It just depends. Okay, if you're in Eastern aircraft, Russian, believe French as well, and some other ones like that, you're going to be getting meters. It's going to be in meters per minute instead of feet per minute. Okay. The next one we're going to take a look at is your turn coordinator. Now, your turn coordinator, if you see this bank here, it does not show bank angle. What it shows is turn rate. Okay, and we're going to kind of go more into this when we get into instrument flight. But for basic flying, you want to see, or basic handling, what you want to see is the important part is this bottom part right here. Okay, which is the slip and turn indicator. Okay, slip and skid. If this ball is not in the middle, if it's over here on the left, the easiest way of thinking about this is step on the ball. So if the ball's on the left, you want to gently step on that left rudder to center that ball. If the ball's on the right, you want to gently step on that right rudder to put that ball back in the middle. Okay? If it's in the middle, that means the aircraft is in coordinated flight. That means the airflow is going equally over both wings. Okay? If it is in uncoordinated flight where the airflow is unequal on both wings, you can actually stall one wing before the other, which will flip the aircraft or put it into what's called a spin. Okay? We'll go into those in a little bit another date. So, as we saw in the prior, those 6-pack, the instruments that we saw up there, those are typically what you find in older aircraft. You don't see those too often in the more modern fighter aircraft or military training aircraft. What you will see is a heads-up display. And the heads-up display basically combines most of that information into one source. So it makes it easier for pilots to get that information. I'll kind of show you how to decipher this. So, with most heads-up displays, you're going to find the heading indicator, right, where it's that upper portion right there, which is showing the heading of the aircraft. Okay. Then you have the altimeter, which is usually on the right-hand side. Okay, it's either a tape like the one here on the A29, or it's going to be a box with a number in it like the T45. Okay. Sometimes you can configure it where it shows both. Sometimes it's one or the other. It just depends, but it's almost always there on the right-hand side. But it's showing the same information as your altimeter. Okay. Airspeed indicator, which is your airspeed right there on the left-hand side, which will show it in either knots or meters depending on the aircraft. AOA indicator, okay, which is showing the current angle of attack of the aircraft. Your flight path marker, this is unique to heads-up displays, okay, because that flight path marker is essentially showing where the aircraft is going at that exact moment. Okay, it is moving to that exact spot, right? And most aircraft with a heads-up display, with some exception for the early or late Cold War ones like the F-14 and some like that, don't have a flight path marker unless they're in certain modes. But most modern aircraft will have this flight path marker on there, okay? And you can use that to help you determine what the aircraft is doing, right? It's a combination between the flight path marker and the pitch ladder, which is giving you your attitude indicating, right? So it's going to tell you if you're in a climb, in a bank, whatnot, and if the aircraft is moving up or moving down, right? So you have that, one of the lines on that pitch ladder is a artificial horizon. And that flight path marker in relation to that horizon tells you if you're descending or climbing. So you can get a lot of information off the HUD if you know how to read it. And then you have the angle of bank indicator here on the bottom as well. Okay, and those are going to tell you how far banked you are. Now, each of those lines change or have a different representation from aircraft to aircraft. So you need to read the manual for your aircraft to know what each of those represent. Some go from 5 to 10 to 30, 5, 15, 30, 5, 10, 20, 30, 5, 10, 20, 60. It just depends on the aircraft itself. Okay, each one is a little different. Okay, now that we've gone over the fundamental physics and common controls and instruments, it's time to get some flight time in. The practical exercises that you should be practicing at this stage fit into two categories. You have fundamental maneuvers and aerobatics. Fundamental maneuvers consist of straight and level flight, constant speed climbs and descents, turns at a set angle of bank, and slow flight. Okay, the slow flight allows you to simulate the same conditions you're going to see when you're coming in for landing and or taking off. Okay, so you learn how the aircraft handles in that environment and how to keep it under control. Now, the best way or the point of all of these is learning discipline flying. You hit an airspeed, you hit an altitude, you hit a descent rate. You get good at hitting all of these parameters, so that when you go to landing the aircraft, taking off the aircraft, you can make sure that you stay within the parameters of that aircraft. Okay. The next ones that come up are going to be aerobatics, which is going to be the classic loop, the Immelmann, the Split S, and last, the Cuban 8. Okay. Now, we're going to have separate videos on these soon, and you'll see how these are done. And if you look through the basic flight manual, you will see an explanation for all of these maneuvers and aerobatics in there, walking you through how to do them and the successful parameters are for those maneuvers. Okay? See you guys in the next lesson.